Hello, everybody. Hello, Slack community. I'm honored to be here. I am like, what what questions does anyone have for me? But I'll try to do my best.
Awesome. All right. So this is going to be a fun and fascinating conversation with Rick. Uh, I want to know your origin story. Okay. And let's dig into this a little bit because, disclaimer, I grew up a fiction nerd, reading a lot of comic books. I'm very much into people's origin stories. Plus, I just love learning how did you become this superhero, right? You weren't always the Rick, right? You were Erica once upon a time. You didn't even study data back in the day. Tell us a little bit about your journey. How did you get to the world of data?
Yeah, gosh, what a loaded big question. How do I make this super concise? I think that being the youngest of six kids, where your five siblings are like the smartest kids in class. All the teachers accidentally call you your sister's names. And didn't want, I wanted to be different. I also have like a very thick skin now because of that. But I would see what they
Wow.
would do and I would just be like, I want to be a pastry chef. And so I um, told myself if I didn't get into my early decision, I was going to go to pastry school. But I did,
Hmm.
and I was like, all right, well, I'm now in college and I switched my major five times. All of my friends,
Five.
five times. All of my friends were like, really like go-getters, pre-professional school. And I was just like, I just want to choose something that like fits around my life. Um,
Mm.
because I wanted to put my happiness first. And I was between two job decisions where I was either going to be a videographer for a nonprofit that would interview artists around like, Philadelphia and anyone visiting, or I was going to work at DBT Labs as a data person. But
Wow.
I was like, I just want to be able to, enjoy my life. And I was doing like a internship at, where they would bring like international students to the school, and I went to the Philadelphia Museum of Art, was staring at this painting of Monet, and this woman comes up over to me, and she was like, "Honey, like you've been looking at that painting all day. Like, what's going through your mind?" And I told her I was deciding between these two routes, and she was like, "Honey, I've been an artist in Philadelphia for 40 years. Your art
Mhm.
will always be there." And I really chose data because the nonprofit that I wanted to work at wasn't going to pay me a livable wage. And
Mhm.
um, I really just wanted to sit at my computer, listen to music, and be able to potentially work out of a van. And I was like, what job will allow me to do that? And then I ended up at then Fishtown Analytics. I was a second employee, and now I'm here. And I love data.
Oh, wow. That's wild. That is wild. So I'm fairly new. You know this, but some of our friends online may not. I'm still fairly new to DBT Labs. I've been here 6 weeks. A lot of the colleagues that I've spoken to didn't necessarily have a traditional path into the data profession either. And I find that really interesting. Yours is maybe one of the most far flung that I've heard. You were an artist and now you are in data. Some people would say it's hard to have those two skill sets. How is it that do you feel like you always were an analytical person, or did you just sort of build those skills along the way?
Yeah, I think that I was able to kind of, I wouldn't say analytical in the sense of like math was my worst subject. Um, I did HTML on Neopets and Zanga, but um,
Wow.
I I think that like I would see the stories behind things and understand the context by just like picking up these like qualitative data points. And I just worked my entire life. I've always had like side jobs and things like that. And so for this role, I was just like, I could probably do that. And data is really just around like seeing the stories and seeing the context. Yeah. And so I think that that's why I like this so much. And I think anyone can be a data person, because if you can just infer points around your life or like make stories based off of those little pieces, then you could be a data person.
That's wild. And we're going to talk quite a bit. I appreciate you sharing this. You've always been pretty transparent, actually, with not only your career journey, but what's going on in your life around your career. As I mentioned, folks, Erica is a beautiful writer. She has a Substack titled A Search for Meaning. I'll see if I can pop the link into the chat for you guys. It's a worthwhile read. So you've always sort of given us insight into what's going on. I made this allusion at the beginning of the conversation to the one ring of power. This reminds me of the whole Frodo's whole journey to get the ring of power, and how in our careers, whether we're a data person or we are data adjacent, like I, for example, have been for much of my career, we all typically have this vision for our careers. It's like we see that pinnacle, whether it's CMO or head of data or CTO, whatever the title is. And particularly when we're earlier in our career, Rick, we're like, one day I'm going to get to the top of the mountain. You got to the top of the mountain, Rick. You made it. Like, we just want to touch the hem, touch the cloth. and yet, Rick, somehow things transpired to where you voluntarily decided not to continue to stay at the top of that mountain. If the game is Queen of the Hill, you voluntarily took the crown off. Like, what is she doing? We're going to get there, but let's not get ahead of ourselves. So that's sort of a precursor. Why don't we start a bit closer to the beginning, Rick, of one's career journey? So there are people on the call today, data professionals, who are trying to climb that mountain. Could we talk a little bit about maybe some of the skill sets or milestones that you think were useful in helping you to climb from IC, individual contributor, to eventually getting that head of data role?
Yeah. I'll be honest, I never wanted to be like a data leader in the space. It was more so like Tristan had saw something in me that I didn't see in myself, because I was like, I want to see if I want to be an ML engineer. I'm going to work at like this bigger company and like strive towards that. But I think the thing that really had set like me in terms of like my skill sets was one being like just wanting to help and coming from like a place of like empathy and full transparency. So I would say like, I don't really know this. I'm worried about this. Is this how you do this? And just like being open to feedback, I think that like going from like an IC to then being a manager, you have to understand that it's not about the title. It's about, do you want to help people like with their careers? Do you want like, what's the meaning behind like you doing this? And so for me, it was like, I really like mentoring people. I like talking about the bigger picture and the strategies. I like live in my head so more than I live in like my reality. But I think in terms of other skill sets, it's like kind of like from like the hard skills of kind of being able to see things from like a like granular to like 300-foot view of like, okay, we're doing this, but what's the meaning behind this? Like, what are we actually trying to be striving for here? And then like kind of then communicating it outward of like, I think this could be improved, or like we're working on this, but have we considered this? And also just like meeting folks in the community too was huge for me. Like you can only know as much as your
Mm.
career as like as what you've experienced. And so it's important, I think, to reach out to other leaders that you admire, and just like ask for like a coffee chat. I think that those things are like super key, and also just like
Mm.
self-awareness. And people like, I, I mean, I don't mean to humble brag, but I think a lot of people enjoy working with me because it's, I don't take anything too seriously, where I'm like trying to have a fun, engaging conversation, um, and getting to know the person and then understanding what are the pain points. And so more people are willing to like rope me into conversations if I'm being like
Mm.
fully honest.
This is actually an interesting perspective that you're sharing, and I appreciate you, putting that on the table because, for example, I mentioned I'm fairly new in my role. I've been working with my data counterparts here at DBT Labs. I work in marketing, so I'm the community manager. I have a little bit of a technical background, but I'm not nearly as well versed in the data systems currently. I'm working on it. I'm not nearly as well versed as my counterparts, so that's cool. Um, and so sometimes, Rick, I will have a data question. And
Hmm.
then I'm like, should I ask this? But it sounds like a stupid question. I feel like I should already know this. And sometimes I end up not asking the question. Other times I ask. And when I do ask, I have to give a lot of credit to my data analyst counterparts here at DBT Labs. They not only help me find the answer, step one, but then they actually show me how I could self serve the next time. And if I have follow up questions, how I could almost start to play with the systems myself. So you've highlighted the value of soft skills and being able to relate to people, and I hope folks are sort of grasping the importance and the value of that. But could you talk as well a little bit, Rick, about like when you're hiring for a data professional on your team, how are you balancing these hard skills and these soft skills to ultimately choose the person that's going to fill the role?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think that for the like hard skills, for me, it's like it depends on like what role it is. So like for an analytics engineer, it's like, are you just thinking about the end result, or are you actually thinking about like the like processes and like the system to get there, and like what you're actually building for, where it's like long term. So like for
Mm-hmm.
example, um, if I ask to make, hey, can you make this like take all this data and make an orders table, um, and then they just have all of like the raw data, like raw sources, like referenced in one giant like model, but not thinking about how these things build up or thinking about long-term scale. That is for me like the thing where it's you're just doing it to do the end result, but you're not thinking about like what the
Mm.
meaning is behind like when you like model these things out, what it's like, do you over index on just documentation, and like what is like your thought process as you're building these things out. And it's the same thing for a data
Mm.
analyst, where I give them like a vague question and they kind of don't ask me additional context questions. They just ride off of assumptions that they don't communicate outward, and they don't test, like they don't talk about testing and like verifying what those end results are. And that to me is also like some of the hard skills um, as well as like how do you write SQL? SQL, like you can, it's like building a bike shed, but there are more optimized ways to build a bike shed. Like, do you have comments in like this query? How have you
Mm.
interacted with other counterparts and like your stakeholders? Um, where I think data analyst is especially really hard because you have to like um, talk to your stakeholders and kind of like understand the context and the reason why behind it. Um, so I think like that's from like a hard skilled perspective, and then the soft skills, it's like I like say this and I will keep beating this drum, is like what sets apart a good data practitioner and a great one is empathy, where
Mhm.
like you can get mad as much as you want about all these reactive stakeholder requests, but trying to understand where they're coming from and also like communicating the outward, of like things that they're going to need because you can understand their perspective, is so vital. And it's a lot harder to have impact if people don't want to work with you and don't want to include you in conversations. And so I'm like very like amazed by my team because they're all incredibly smart, but they're also like incredible people.
I love that. Your team, Rick, we're gonna humble brag on your team a little bit, but your team won most fun, most fun team at the most recent company kickoff meeting. I think that was about a year ago. The kickoff is coming up in a couple of months. Rick, I'm gonna throw down the gauntlet now. The community team is coming for that title. We're coming.
The
We're
community
coming
teams
for it,
started
Rick.
making their own swag too, which was our thing. And so I'm on Natasha.
Ooh. Them's fighting words. But on a more serious note, I have heard. So tell me how true these ring. The statement, "Data can be a thankless job," or the statement, "Data can be order taking instead of being consultative." Is that like a reality for some of our data counterparts?
Oh my God. I think that we're definitely not like a ticket intake monkeys at all. We're very much so like partners with our embedded folks. And so I think that we like don't have that much experience. I think thankless could be in terms of um, like people are always going to want more and they don't really quite understand like the process that it takes to get there. I think that like now I don't feel that way. I think that there was a time, but that was only because I didn't like state my boundaries. And people just didn't know. Like leaders
Mm,
didn't know what I was feeling. And so once I was able to like kind of evoke that, then it didn't feel that way. And
mm,
I also am like, I don't feel like any of our work that we do or that our data team feels like it's like thankless work. I think it's sometimes hard work for sure. Um, but it's important also to communicate that outward. And I think that that's like really the big thing.
wow. Goodness. That's powerful right there. I mean, the fact that someone, maybe an executive in a board meeting, could on a whim ask a data question and then not realize that your team is spending 20 hours or 30 hours coming up with the answer, only to have them be like, "Oh, interesting." And then they don't really do anything with the data in the first place. Maybe they didn't realize how much work you were putting in to give them that response in the first place.
Yeah. And it's like I think that before, like earlier in my career as head of data, um, that's what I initially felt like. Like we were small team, high output, and it was crazy how much we were doing. But I think the thing that you always have to ask is like, okay, if you were to know this is like how much time it like this like what would you do with it, and I always communicate like, okay, this specific question that you want is going to take more time, um,
Oh.
and then so then if like you're able to kind of deduce it down to like, okay, you actually want to know this. I think that that's kind of like the art behind the science.
Yeah, yeah. You know, I'm looking in the chat right now, folks. Thanks for sharing your voices in the chat. Continue to share in there. This is going to be very interactive. We do have a couple of people who identify as solution architects today. We've got some data engineers in here also. So this is really exciting to see. But I'm imagining that the experience could be quite varied depending on where in the ecosystem people fit. Like if someone, for those of our friends, Crystal, James, and others who are solution architects, I'm very interested in some of the challenges that you all are facing in your positions. Rick, is that a title, solutions architect, that you're able to orient? What do they tend to do?
Yeah, I mean, it's different at every company. I think it depends. Like, for example, our solution architects, we call them like field engineers, or some folks call them sales engineers. At DBT, they're essentially like um, analytics engineers that like help. like take some of like the features that we're doing or like talk about some of like the more like technical problems that our customers are facing, and
Mm-hmm.
kind of explain like alternative ways of doing it, and explaining like, so, some of like the more in-depth product experiences. And so that's like,
Mm-hmm.
um, I think something that, you have to utilize a lot of data for. And I have so much respect for anyone who is external facing. When I was a consultant, when we were doing consulting at Fishtown/DBT Labs, it was like external facing is such a hard role.
Yeah.
I love having like internal facing where like my coworkers are my customers. So yes, Crystal, a little bit of everything. That also sounds very accurate. Sometimes I would just hold my breath when I would go into customer calls, and I'm like, what the heck is going to happen now?
I love it. I love it. We actually have a couple of questions that were submitted that one of those is maybe going to be particularly relevant to this. I'd love to hear Crystal's perspective as well. Jenna's on as well. Jenna Jordan. We want to hear some of this is a safe space. We want to hear some of the nightmare stories, some of the failures, some of the really hard experiences, data projects that didn't go well. Do you have any of those in your backpack, Rick? Any that you're able to share with us today?
About data experiences that didn't go well.
Yes, yes, we want all the tea.
Well, it was December of 2022, and I will never forget this. Where our like sales, one of our sales leaders, they're asking about customer mapping and how it was like off, and I was like, okay, we're gonna put this in our backlog,
Okay.
and I was so overwhelmed at the time, and like I kind of was like, okay, we can address this like next month. But then they then went on scheduled a 15-minute sync with me. And that,
Mm-hmm.
As an anxious person, I was like, oh no. And then they were just
Mm-hmm.
like, these are all the problems I'm experiencing by not having this thing. Like, this is what my like sales folks are like struggling with, blah, blah, blah. And I was like, I logged off and I just broke down crying.
Oh man.
And so it was at a time where like I wasn't good about prioritizing the backlog. I was like just like ticket intaking. And I think that the thing that didn't go well was that I wasn't kind of like looped in on those conversations. I didn't really ask the friction points or like the impact of it. And it's like a very classic thing.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't look back at that with any ill like feelings. If anything, one of my old managers were like, this is an experience where like your thought process and like the action things that you took afterwards were correct. And as much as like this hurts, you'll never forget it. And so it's true though. It's like all of those things, it's like you don't forget, but you don't let it like weigh on you as like a failure. So yeah, it was just like not really being involved in those conversations early on, or like understanding and having empathy for what they were going through.
Mm. Mm, 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 mm. I mean, Rick, she came up with the date right away, like December 2022. It was a dark and stormy night.
It was a dark and
But you
stormy night in New York City.
just took us right into the moment, man. I
Yeah.
felt that. I felt that. And yeah, that's actually one of I've been in some service type positions in the past, whether internal or external, throughout my career. And goodness, those type of calls can be tough, especially when like the call has been scheduled, they're going to talk about the bad news, but how you build from that moment,
Mhm.
goodness, I think you really use it as a stepping stone versus a weight or a millstone to hold you down. So kudos to
Yeah.
you and to your former manager.
Um, Thank you. Yeah, it was like, is this going to be my hero origin story or my villain origin story? As you come to a fork in
Oh,
the road.
that's too good. That's too
Yeah.
good. That's too good. Yeah. So I mentioned I used to read comic books quite a bit. Okay, I lied. I still read comic books quite a bit. We all gotta have a vice, all right?
I
But
don't need advice.
yeah, you don't now. Superheroes are kind of cool now. When I was a kid, not so much. But there's this interesting framing. I just sort of like them because they're like modern mythology. And there was this really interesting framing. If anyone's familiar with DC Comics, so we all probably know Batman. So Batman's nemesis, most famous nemesis, is the Joker. And so the Joker came up with this concept. I promise this is going to relate to data. He came up with this concept of one bad day. And his theory was, let's talk like data professor. His hypothesis was, this is actually like a data problem. His hypothesis was that anyone could be a hero or a hero, but all it takes is for them to experience one really bad day for them to become a villain. And so he wanted to prove that Batman could be just as bad as himself, the Joker. And so he went about to helping Batman, very kindly, helping Batman to have a really, really bad day, kidnapping all of Batman's loved ones and so on and so forth. This sounds like your one bad day moment, and you were able to flip it into a positive thing. But, we could chuckle about this, but I think a lot of us are going to have a number of these moments throughout our careers. You shared one, Rick, that really moved me on your blog. You wrote it about a year ago, and you wrote about being the head of data. Now we're getting into it, folks. We're getting into the lead. You talk about being the head of data and experiencing just a whole lot of overwhelm. Would you mind taking us back to that moment, what that felt like, and how it played out?
Yeah, sure. So for context, like when I was hired as like head of data, um, I just straight up told Tristan, I was like, you realize that you're hiring a 25-year-old to be a head of data at DBT Labs. And he was like, we'll figure it out. And I had always echoed to him, like, I do not want to be a VP. Like the thing that I enjoy is like working with my team and working with people. And that just like role has never really appealed to me. Like I didn't come back to be head of data to be a head of data. If anything, I just came back for the people. And so I think that like throughout like the time where I was head of data, I had told Tristan like a year into it where I was like, we could probably start hiring someone else to like be my manager and like, take over. But the thing that was really hard for me to let go of was like, I loved my team so much and I loved the culture that I had built. And I deeply feared like that someone would come in and like kind of like, excuse my French, but like fuck it up, and just like take it all away from me. And so
That's real. That's real.
And I mean, like 2023 was a hard year for everybody. And especially for data teams, like trying to crunch numbers, like not having, and it was tough. And so I was just like under a lot of stress. I was like, I didn't feel joy in my work. And I like loved my work and I felt like I was seeing like my team get really stressed out and like I kind of like wanted to reiterate to everybody where I was like, I have been in this role and I feel like there are other people that have had so much tenure because I'm working off of first principles and I don't really have an acting manager because Tristan's the CEO and he was my manager and there's only so much time that he could give me. And when I like sat down and really thought about like what I enjoyed about my work, because I was also thinking about moving to being an IC again. I was like,
wow.
the things that give me joy is like being able to like run my team in this way and like being able to look at like different ways of, how do we move strategically? How do we framework things? What are some repeatable things going on? And so I was like, I still want to manage people. And if there comes a time where like someone else could do my role better, then I'm like, I'm not tied to it. And if that like if I don't want to manage people anymore, I want to be an IC, then like I can do that. But I was always worried more so of like, how would my team feel? And they were just so supportive about it. And I was really lucky because I got to hire my boss, who was actually like the first Alex was the first data leader to ever reach out to me when I first started as head of data, where he wanted to know my opinion. And so it was this crazy 2 year later full circle moment when he applied. And now, like, our team culture is still really great. I love having a manager. I love not having to be in those high leadership meetings and then feel like I'm flying off the seat of my pants. And yeah, it was like overall like a great decision. And I'm like really grateful for, still being able to manage, still being at this company.
That's powerful. I've just got to say, I feel like that took a lot of self-awareness, a lot of self-acceptance too, because goodness, we've all been there, right? Maybe you're on the job market or you're trying to move up in the world, and we not only try to put our best foot forward, we almost try to hide the aspects of ourselves that aren't our greatest strengths. But those get exposed. Like, nobody is great at everything. I really value the fact that you were comfortable in what you were good at and what gave you joy in your work. And you're like, I want to try to make my way back to that. I think that's so valuable.
Yeah. And I think that, like, when you're in the weeds every day, I feel like a lot of people don't do self-check-ins with themselves. And kind of like now I can feel when I'm starting to feel stressed or like overwhelmed. And every day I like do like a quick summary of my day where I'm like, what did I do? And what have I been thinking about? And what was the most significant thing that happened? And I think that if I didn't have those check-ins with myself now, I think that I would just like be miserable. And that's the thing I always tell people whenever they're applying for a job or like thinking about, moving up and going into management is like, one, really look at the people that you're speaking to. Look at the leaders. Like, are those leaders the type of people that you want to help like push that vision and support them? And do you actually like what those things are? Or, what are the things in your current role that like you enjoy? And if it's still doing things like, I worked on this crazy like modeling project and now our runtime runs like in like third as much and like all these other technical things. And it's like, okay, well, I don't know if you actually want to be a manager. Maybe you want to be a lead. And I think that that's like an important like differentiation of just being like really honest with yourself and like leaning into your feelings.
I could tell you mentor people a lot. Because this feels like a career mentoring session. I'm like, I should be paying Rick for this. This is good. But you touched on something really quickly. I do want to get to some of the topics that some of our friends brought up in the chat, like Cloud CLI. There's been questions about Semantic Layer. We're about to get to that. Before we hop to that, Rick, I'd love it if you could talk about this question. How do we know we're doing data well? How do you measure your value? Is it SLA time? Rick is laughing. Is it time to insights? Like, we don't know. What does good look like, Rick? Help us out.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. It's like I laugh because that's such a classic thing with data teams is like, how do we measure our value and our impact? And so like I have a few things there where it's like from like an analytics engineering side, I would say that like uptime is a big one. How much like the cost optimization and like you can talk about like output of like models, but like that doesn't really mean anything because you can build like 1,000 dbt models doesn't mean that they're good. But from a general perspective, like one of the things that we started doing now is we link all of the projects that we're doing to initiatives, like company level initiatives. And so when we contribute to those things, then we can say like, okay, this work that we did linked to this and helped move this. That's like linked to this like company OKR. That's like more tied closely. And so that's like from, if you want to do like more like quantitative-esque version, but I would say that one of the other things is like when leaders go into meetings, do they have a dashboard that they're pulling up constantly? What are like your most used assets? Do folks like reference like do they loop you into conversations, and how integrated are you with them? Because that like it shouldn't be about like some of it's like sentiment of your coworkers, but a lot of it objectively is like look at all these things that like we have created that are used constantly and are actually helping move productivity, because there are like a lot of dashboards that we have created, like dashboard tools that help people be more productive in their jobs. So that I think is like another like version of it.
I love that. And that almost, I don't know if the dots are connected, Rick, but the fact that your background was a little bit more on the arts side, I feel like you connect the two sides of the brain so well. How often are your dashboards being used? How often are you being integrated into conversations? I love that at DBT Labs, for example, most of the data professionals are almost embedded with different parts of the business. So for me, working in marketing, I have someone on the data team who works just with marketing. He's our dedicated person. I think those are pretty interesting ways to measure value for a data team.
Oh yeah. No, yeah. I think for sure it's such like a classic thing, because data teams, as they scale up, become a very expensive cost center. And so it's sometimes hard to justify like where we add value. And so making sure that your leaders are like really like knocking that home, and like that you can also speak about your work's impact. I think that's really important for ICs to know the impact of your work.
Yeah. That's good. That's good. All right. We got to take some questions here. Deep Shah has asked, he's working on ClickHouse. Are you familiar?
I'm actually not super familiar with ClickHouse. I'm so sorry, Deep.
Okay, cool. No worries, no panic, Deep. So Erica has a whole team behind her. Why don't we, Deep, if you should be in the Slack community as well. Would you mind popping that question in there? What we'll do, I'll make sure I connect a couple of folks who are familiar with ClickHouse so we can get you exactly the answer that you need. I appreciate you asking the question. He also asks, so your second question, Deep, you're asking how you can achieve more efficient transformation of your data after loading through. That might be related to ClickHouse specifically as well. So let's go ahead and get that question into Slack, and we will be sure to follow up. There was a question about Cloud CLI, and you got really excited about that, Rick. Talk to us about that a little bit. What's your experience with CLI, and why does it fire you up so much?
Oh my God. It's funny because I was literally talking about the Cloud CLI to our executives literally yesterday. And so one of the things that about the Cloud CLI is that when it first launched, I'm not going to lie, I was like, why would I install this? I already have core. I'm like a very much like, I switch between like the IDE, local on my laptop. And I was like, why would I already have like core here? But the Cloud CLI, like one of the big things that I have really loved about it is I don't have to worry about upgrading my version for DBT Core, which is like huge, because if like you've ever gone through some of the updating locally on Core, it can be such a process. And with the Cloud CLI, it's like so much closer to your prod schema too. And so that's one of the things I also love about it, is like it does like deferrals. And so you can actually run things a lot faster. You're able to like clone your prod schema into your dev schema and feel like it's one-to-one with like what exists. And it's just like the overhead work that I do with just versioning and just like, trying to reconcile what's local versus like what's in prod. In terms of versioning, it's just like all that headache is gone. And so it's like such like a seamless experience. And, all of the things I have in terms of my dev credentials in cloud are like one-to-one with my like local like VS Code. But now I'll be honest, like I love the cloud CLI. I think it's like a really great option for folks who maybe they like love VS Code or like love their code editor and they don't want to change it. But I will say the IDE, if any of y'all are early DBT folks, the IDE has come a long, long heckin' way. And there's like a lot of like nice one-to-one there as well. And like being able to develop semantic layer metrics in the IDE is huge. So I really love it. And Alex, to your point in terms of like process of setting it up, it's super easy. Like there's if you go into like your cloud environment, I think you go into develop, you can just download your development configs and then just like put it in your editor. But also like if you're a team of analysts, you can also use the IDE, which is like essentially one-to-one as well. So it's like, why would you need to use the CLI? All of our analysts use the IDE.
That's great. That's great. Thank you for the questions and the comments, folks. And thanks for jumping directly onto that, Rick. That was really cool. You have thoughts about the semantic layer. There were some questions about semantic layer that were submitted ahead of time. I want to hear your thoughts on it. Someone actually wanted to know whether there are tips for when using or adopting semantic layer. So just sort of broadly first, talk to us about semantic layer. What's your take on it?
The semantic layer is like huge. Like I love the semantic layer. I think that like I have an entire like coalesce talk about this. And we also link our best practices. So if y'all ever want to check that out, I think it's on YouTube. But the semantic layer, it's like for so long, you had to kind of create your DBT models in a way to fit your BI tool. And that's like not super great because sometimes it doesn't follow like the ideal best practices. And so what the semantic layer allows you to do is like, rather than having this like in between of your DBT models to then like your metrics in the BI tool, it's all in like, you can just own it. And so you're not vendor locked into like a BI tool. You're reporting on metrics consistently. And you're able to see what models like touch those semantic layer metrics. And so I think that the semantic layer just encourages best practices. I think it's really helpful for if you ever want to like incorporate, like what is it called? I think Snowflake now has this new app that we're integrated with called Blizzard, where you can like ask questions around your metrics, and you can like pull it aside and like add all the metadata in there. And so you can say like, how do I find what our ARR is? And it'll kind of read through all the semantic layer manifest JSON files and pull in like what metrics to use and like where they come from. And it's like, it's so great for like scaling your self-serve experience.
That's cool. That's pretty helpful. We're getting to that stage, Rick. We have about 10 minutes left. I want to get people out before the top of the hour. This is a lot of fun. You guys have been super engaged in the chat, which I appreciate. We're at the stage where we need to. Rick does a lot of these talks. She's always so smooth. She's always so polished. We gotta stump Rick. We gotta find. Okay, so Deep gave us the ClickHouse question.
ClickHouse. I'm stumped on. I'm sorry if you have anything about ClickHouse or Databricks. I'm sorry, I didn't lose or things.
Well done, Deep. Put a chink in the armor. I want to ask about data governance. Whether you could talk to us about that, because I think that's something a lot of companies struggle with. What are your takes on data governance?
Oh my God, it's really interesting because I think that data governance is like almost like this piece of a bigger pie. And so we don't have like a lot of like data tooling that's like growing rapidly around data governance. Personally, at our company, we actually have created our own like custom like masking process, like custom macros to mask our certain data based off of our like folks' different roles that they can like that they're able to log into. And so, for example, our people ops team can only see employee data. Like they're the only folks that are allowed to see like personal employee data. Same thing for our finance team, et cetera. And so there are a lot of ways that you can do that in DBT. And if anything, that's also something that we have, I believe, with Mesh, where you can like make certain models like private or public. But in terms of like dynamic masking policies, that's something that like we've created a macro for, and we're trying to like get our product, our PMs to incorporate that into our product. And so there are actually a lot of DBT features that we were actually the pioneers for, like micro batching incremental models. That was us. Yeah.
Nice. Okay, I appreciate that. I'm gonna see if I can get more folks coming on here to the AMA's friends to talk about data governance, because I think it's an evolving space and it's one that we all are hungry to learn more about. So thank you for sharing your perspective on that, Rick. Deep is asking, Rick, if you can talk about efficient data transformation using DBT, regardless of what data warehouse he's actually using.
Oh yeah. So efficient is like, it depends on like what your definition of efficient is. If we're talking about like model runtime, I would say that like one of the things that we started doing, because our project I think is like, it's like 1,500 models right now. We're like meshifying it, but efficiency is like how fast do you need this data? Because, or is it okay if like, this model takes 30 minutes to run? Is that okay? You can, and so that's where like things like incremental models come in and like breaking things apart. Like,
right.
I think that it's so much easier to kind of like have steps with it. Like if you have this giant model, kind of going back to my analytics engineering like interview question, is like, how do you actually just take all of those nested logic and actually break it down into the sum of its parts? I think that actually allows you to do more like, these are all the steps it takes to then get into this bigger one. And so that's like much more of an efficient perspective, and also better for like brain space too. Like being able to kind of like work backwards from what are like the entities that you care about, like what are the actions that those like entities do, and then working backwards of like, where are those sources coming from? Do we need to do an incremental approach? Should we do some cold storage on it? Because after like for event models, you don't need to like full refresh those models like after, if they're like a month old, just like cold storage.
Gotcha.
That's what they are. So things like that are important considerations, like the way you materialize them. Should they be tables? Should they be views? And like, yeah, I think that's when it gets a little bit more nested into like warehousing conversations. And Crystal, I saw that you also had mentioned something about snapshots. Like, do you snapshot to like the left or to the right of your pipeline? And my gut is always snapshotting as early as possible, closest to the source. So that way you can see the way that things change as like you're going through like the steps of like, where did things break down? The only time where I say that snapshotting to the right is helpful is that if you're snapshotting like metrics, where some of those definitions might change over time. It's important to have that as like a point in time reference, but as early as possible in the DAG is something that I recommend. We mostly snapshot our source tables.
Thank you for that. I think Crystal had a follow-up question about masking policies or grants falling off. due to the concept of
Hmm.
dropping and creating certain tables?
Oh yeah. So we do falling off to the concept of dropping and creating certain tables. Gosh, okay. I need to pull up our DBT project to see like how we implement this. I think that we also do post hooks. I know that for sure. But Crystal, if you DM me in Slack, feel free to. My Slack handle is at Erica. And so I can like actually give you a better answer there.
Awesome. Appreciate it. Crystal, you're getting the DMs to DM access to the queen here. So, take advantage. Don't abuse it.
Mhm.
Thank you for being generous with your time there, Rick. We have a couple of questions in Slido, so I'm going to slide over there and ask those questions as well to you, Rick. Here's one. It says, would you ever recommend a team org brand new to DBT to start with a multi-project DBT mesh right from the start? What conditions would you consider?
Oh my goodness. Okay. This is a great question. I would say don't start with mesh first. I think that mesh is like the thing that's appealing about it is for companies that have like over 1,000 models. Hence why like we're meshifying our project. I would
Mhm.
actually say that like start off with like the core things that you need. Like what are the core like entities that you're measuring? What do folks need to see repeatedly that are critical? And then working backwards from there, because then you're going to see like, okay, you have these, core models that represent each org. Um, and then as your project develops, you can kind of see the way that like some of the parts of the DAG start splitting off. And when it starts splitting off like a huge chunk of it, that's when it's like, okay, this should actually be a mesh project. And
Mhm.
meshing is like something that you do, I think, if you have like multiple like data, like data pods, that may be uh, like for example, we're kind of like a hybrid approach between like EPD, go to market, and corp. And like there are some like very core things that we need that represent for the entire business that everyone's going to need to touch. But then like corp
Mhm.
pod, which is like finance and stuff, they're going to have like their own separate mesh project because they have specific permissions. We don't need to run that entire huge DAG. It could be separated. And so that's when you
Mhm.
start like thinking about meshifying. But
Mhm.
keep it in your mind too. Always have your DAG represent your business, um, and the way that like some parts of the business like don't necessarily like I don't think that much about like accounting rev rec stuff, and I don't really need to know that much about it. I'll be honest. And so that's like its own separate area of our DAG that's like separated out, and that's like when things start changing and breaking modularly. Yeah.
Accountants, we love you.
We do. I love my account. I love our accounting team personally. Mike, Jason, Yuchin,
Uh,
this is for you.
yes, yes, yes. All right, Rick, if you had to build a data team from scratch without having executive buy-in at the beginning, that's the key part. What
Mhm.
would your maybe 1 year plan be and your 5 year plan be? So building a data team from
Mhm.
scratch, no executive buy-in.
Okay, so I would probably go to the execs and say like, per exec, like, what do you need? Like, what's like the repeatable reporting that you need? What do we report to the board? What do you need to see? And if they give me this long list of like, whatever, then I would say like, okay, then we need to be able to build these things with this capacity. Like we'll only be able to do this. If we're structured in this way, then we'll be able to accomplish all of these. But like it depends on like what your prioritization is. And in terms of like then that's when I would start like hiring people out depending on like that business need. Um, but then in terms of like the 5 year trajectory conversations too, if we're having those same conversations that day, it would be like, where do you see the business scaling? Like, where are we investing more time in? Like, what are the upcoming like big bets that we're taking? And then saying like, okay, then we're going to need to invest data sources and like this resources in this area. Um,
Mhm.
and I really believe in like um, you need to first do the foundations which feels more services, but that is a jumping off point to then being more as partners. And I feel very strongly about data teams being semi-embedded, because you can't hold all of the knowledge of the entire business in your head. And it's really hard to build relationship with stakeholders. And so I would also say that like I would want our team to grow into being a hybrid embedded model.
This is fascinating. This is fascinating. You've talked before, Rick, about the concepts of data as a service versus data as a product. And there's a question here that says, should data teams fulfill the traditional service desk function? And if so, how can they do that while not losing out investing time into strategic projects? So I feel like we're kind of digging into this similar area, this related area here. How are data teams managing this balance between taking orders, being service oriented, and actually being more building out a self-service or data product setup?
Yeah. So it's a really hard adjustment to have to make. And I would say that like one of the things that I would suggest is like having at least like you or like another IC kind of like hold space for like you can have all the tasks in your backlog. And then you can say like we're gonna hold 2 sprint points to doing this independent exploration. And for every like data analyst or like AE, and also having like tech debt days. And then you can then show that analysis or like what the output of that tech debt day was to your execs and to your leaders and say, like, this is like an example, and then their eyes will light up. And then they'll kind of then see what it means to like, if you were actually looking at things strategically. I think that's an example if like if you're like pushing for it and they're just like not hearing it out. And then I think another thing is like kind of talking to the leaders and saying, you know, we're focused on these business areas. Like we need to actually, before you build a dashboard, one of the things I suggest is always like, let's first do an analysis to then determine whether or not like these are the things that we need. Otherwise, we're just going to keep churning out metrics that maybe that don't mean anything. Let's first do an analysis. And so that's like one of the other areas where it's like for us, we hired AEs first to do the foundations and do the foundational modeling. And then as like we were getting to a good point, then you hire a data analyst to then say like, okay, let's like start running with some analyses and like utilizing these models.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really good. That's really good. How is asking whether the webinar is recorded? Absolutely, it is recorded. We'll send you the link in Slack. We'll put it on YouTube. We'll probably put it in the next email newsletter. I'm going to be starting a community newsletter, by the way, because we're going to be putting out a lot more great content with people like Rick. And we're not just talking about information, but actually some entertaining stuff too, and stuff that's featuring community members like yourselves, because you guys have some fascinating stories. Deep, Crystal, Jenna, Hal, Jakob, we want to hear them, right? So Rick is amazing, but you guys aren't too shabby yourselves now. You guys are on the forefronts as well. We're going to be surfacing more of these stories also. This has been a lot of fun. Let's see if we can close it out with one more question for Rick. This is not going to be data related, but Rick, I want to know about Bessie. Who is Bessie and what happened to her?
Oh my God. Bessie was my converted Chevy Express van. She drove me across New York all the way down to California. I named her Bessie because she was white and she had a bed in her. She had like a sink, and she was like she was my converted van that I like moved across the country in. And I named her Bessie because for my first road trip across the US, I wanted to only see the world's largest statues. And there's a cow in North Dakota called Salem Sioux. She's a giant Holstein cow. And with Bessie right next to her, I was like, this is my cow van. So I named her Bessie. And then I lived in it part-time for a year, and then I had to sell her when I moved to Los Angeles because I couldn't fit her anywhere.
Oh, that's sad. Do you know where she ended up? Is she still
Uh,
in LA?
I don't know. I had to sell her, so I don't know where she ended up. Hopefully to a good home, but I would do it all again. I think I want to get a smaller converted car eventually.
This is phenomenal. I put the link to Erica's blog post a little bit earlier, her blog in Substack a little bit earlier. So please do check it out. Subscribe. She hasn't written there in about a year. I
I
think
have a
it's
draft. I have a draft that I will be posting
yes.
at the end of the month.
We we want more. The public is clamoring for more Erica. So Erica, beyond being a data professional, is very much a human, and she shares that. So we're at the top of the hour. I hate to bring it to a close, but y'all got to get back to work. Erica, thank you for being so generous with your time. This was great. I can't wait to do it again.
Thank you so much. All right. Bye, everybody.
Thanks for hanging out, folks. We'll see you on the next one. Come hang out in Slack. Bye for now.